Welcome back to the PFC podcast. The views and opinions you are about to hear are the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of anyone else. Now on to the podcast.
Thank you, Dennis, and welcome to this special edition of the PFC podcast that's focused on medical support to irregular warfare, or MSIW, specifically in the Pacific or the Indo-Pacific Theater. I am Mark Anderson. I'm a member of the MSIW Committee of the Special Operations Medical Association. We'd like to thank Dennis and all of the leadership at the Prolonged Field Care Collective for their mentorship and coaching in helping us get this new podcast off the ground. And I'm really excited to welcome, for this episode on MSIW in the Pacific, welcome a subject matter expert on this, and that is Dr. Andrew Maher. Dr. Maher is a former Australian Army officer who works currently as a senior lecturer at the University of New South Wales in Canberra. He specializes in irregular warfare and special operations studies. He holds a PhD from that institution with a focus on strategy and proxy warfare. Dr. Maher also works as a professor of practice at the Global Security Master's Program at Arizona State University. He has taught at the Joint Special Operations University in Florida, as well as the NATO Special Operations University. And he's been a fellow at West Point's Modern War Institute and a team lead at the Irregular Warfare Initiative. Andy, it's great to speak with you again. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mark. An absolute pleasure.
Is there anything else in your backstory that you'd like to share with the audience before we get going?
So the backstory aspect extends a little bit on the bio that you've just been talking through. As a former military officer, way back in 2014, a decade or so ago, which feels like a lifetime ago, I was serving in Kabul with a focus on institutional capacity building with our Afghan policing partners. And there was very little that had set me or my colleagues up for that experience. I found myself trawling through US doctrine, through UK doctrine, a host of different books and reports, all with an aim of distilling what was really important and then sharing that across my other team members and using that to get into, hey, here's how we need to do business. After finishing that trip, in fact, only a few months later, I found myself in Baghdad now doing a similar thing with the Iraqi police. Again, there was little in this new team that we all had to go on. But we did have this little repository that I'd been able to build only a few months earlier, and I was able to again share that with the team. That whole experience just lit a fire regarding education, writing, research, and somehow I found myself about a decade later, now as a doctor, running classes for young cadets who have just joined the Defence Force, through to, in some cases, War College level officers, and I haven't looked back.
Excellent. Well, Andy, what I'd like to do is I'd like to kick this off by having you give our audience just a briefing, an overview of irregular warfare concepts at the strategic level from a strategist's point of view. And then after you're done with that, we're going to dive into some more of the medical imperatives as they apply to an IW campaign, or more specifically, a UW campaign, perhaps, in the Indo-Pacific Theater.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, excellent. Please, off to you.
Okay, so I'll start off with a bit of a pedantic approach, but if we're going to approach the theme of irregular warfare, a good starting point is with a dictionary. Now here in Australia, we're lucky. We don't have the institutional memory commensurate with the United States in this space. So we can be a little bit more flexible with our doctrine and the way that we approach a topic. That helps when talking with interagency partners who may not have that doctrinal depth. So fairly simply put, approaching it through a dictionary, irregular warfare is the opposite of regular warfare. Now, as everyone's now rolling their eyes going, yeah, thanks, doctor. Appreciate that. Let me explain why this matters. Regular warfare could be viewed as war by regulation. What regulation? Treaties of Westphalia, The Hague, Geneva Conventions, the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of the State. All of these sort of bodies and corpus of knowledge that come together that place the state as central to the way our governments and international relations function. So, irregular warfare is outside of that. It's about non-state actors, where non-state actors engage other non-state actors, civil war, or where non-state actors engage against states, terrorism, insurgency, revolutions. And to me, there's an element of elegant simplicity in narrowing down like that. As I kind of led off with, this differs from the US definition. We're not talking so much about aspects of struggle with that definition, with all the laden background and terminology that comes with. But it has some utility. It helps align to the coding in conflict databases. One that I use routinely is the Uppsala Conflict Dataset Program, where non-state actors and state actors are distinguished. Thus, we can chart over time the number of conflicts that are occurring involving those different parameters that I described just a few minutes before. That matters because actually irregular warfare, conflict involving non-state actors, is the predominant form of conflict, period, as evidenced by these data sets. Second, I think that journey that I've just taken you all through helps also reinforce why the irregular problem is difficult. Well, culturally, our militaries, our governments, our state departments, some of our aid agencies are all used to working through states, operating often against state-based threats. Because this is the opposite of that, it is difficult for those cultures to wrap their head around. So lastly, why does all of this matter for strategists? Well, as I alluded to just a minute ago, it is the most prevalent form of conflict. Included in that calculation is that there is an increasing frequency, as the data sets tell us, of proxy warfare as a component of strategic competition. By proxy warfare, I mean a state supporting a non-state actor to engage in violence that imposes costs on the other competitor. This is an indirect way of going about strategic competition. Because that's on the rise, a trend that basically anchors back to about 2011, maybe slightly earlier. There's a clear alignment here in why this is important now, because that trend is only going up.
On that note, Andy, talking about proxy warfare, your thesis is specifically on that subject, is it not? Excuse me, your dissertation.
Yeah.
Don't you have a book coming out soon?
Yeah, that's right. So was able to clear through the dissertation a bit over a year ago. So we've been working through the book, all going well. Either a Christmas stocking stuffer, I'll take the free plug, thank you, or soon thereafter. We'll
Okay, excellent.
I've titled it The Strategic Logic of Proxy War. And the reason I've done that is because there's a trend here. There's a trend of increasing frequency, but that trend is being driven by this logic. It's a good way of imposing cost. It helps to de-escalate tensions as opposed to risking outright state-on-state conflict, which would be well reminded that actually no state really wants to go to that level. The costs, the risks, the second-order effects, they all add up.
Something that you hit on that I find very interesting is the differences between the way allies and partners look at irregular warfare. I'm wondering whether you can address that because PFC podcast and the emerging MSIW podcast is undoubtedly going to have a predominantly American audience. But we are deeply committed to engaging with our allies and partners and trying to find ways of avoiding the inevitable frictions of having slightly differing doctrine. Can you comment on your knowledge of how the Americans address irregular warfare and its subcomponent missions like unconventional warfare, counterinsurgency, foreign internal defense, etc., and compare that with, for example, the Australian Defence Forces or our friends across the ditch, New Zealand, or other key players in IndoPACOM?
Yeah, a couple of different angles there, Mark. First off, I'll give a plug to my colleagues at the Irregular Warfare Centre. A bit over a year ago, I helped contribute to one of their projects. It was looking at exactly that same problem of how we're all communicating in slightly different ways and helping to interrogate that. So out there in the ether is a report in that regard that talks about some of those differences. In very simple terms, Australia doesn't have a lot in the way of doctrinal terminology in this regard. Certainly it is not as well refined with all of the deep meaning that comes with US doctrine. To a degree as well, countries like Australia, New Zealand, and other countries that have been contributing to US coalitions for quite a while now, we all learn how to speak American as we go about these deployments, and it is part and parcel of the way that we go about doing business, of ensuring that we can also interpret between the two. In terms of practicalities, certainly in the Indo-PACOM area, in US nomenclature, the main game is all about security force assistance. Here we would be using the language of military diplomacy or support to respective partners. We'll use different terminology based around what type of support is being provided, because it helps that proposition land better with different target audiences. If we're working through our diplomats to be engaging with a particular partner, then partner force assistance lands really, really well. It puts a partner front and center, but in reality, it's security force assistance. So I think that element of being able to be an interpreter is useful, not only as we look at this from a coalition perspective and how we all talk with each other, but also how do we be the right chameleons that can communicate with all of these other partners that we're needing to bring on the journey as well. That has some correlations to my PhD, as I talked about before. No one wants to be thought of as a proxy, but from a dictionary definition perspective, then those same dynamics play out. So we've got to also be diplomats in the way that we approach these topics.
I listened to a previous podcast you did with the Irregular Warfare Initiative, and you talked about our needing to become comfortable with the idea that we are not going to be coming into one of these conflicts from a position of strength, that we might find ourselves to be the insurgent that has limited resources, that has long, delicate supply chains, etc. Can you expand on that view? And where I'm going with this is that when we talk about, certainly when I talk with people about irregular warfare, when I talk with guys on teams, in the U.S. Army Special Forces as an example, they are thinking that this is just a new, different term for unconventional warfare, which is something that SF has been focused on for a very long time, since the 50s, and historically much further than that. Can you elaborate on or give me your opinion on where we stand as a group of allies in the Indo-PACOM theater in our preparedness for unconventional warfare as you see it potentially coming?
Sure. So to your first part of the question, Mark, the aspect of, we may find ourselves as the insurgent is, of course, looking at the sheer size and scale of the pacing threat. Here in Australia, our army is a little over 30,000 odd people. That doesn't even get half the size of US SOCOM on its own. Those sort of elements of scale can often be difficult to interpret. And then applying that over a respective area, just the size of Australia on its own is somewhat commensurate to the span of the continental United States. So then as we talk about projecting into the region, similarly, Indonesia spans the same sort of distance of Boston to LA. The distances are huge. Therefore, the areas that may need to be engaged are likewise huge. Populations, huge. Indonesia, approximately fourth largest country in the world in terms of populations, or many of which consist of relatively tribal, and tribal I mean island-based ethnicities. The Javanese are very different from the Ambonese, who are different from the Balinese. And so these sort of sub-regional cultures that are also quite large, how much of a sponge that will be in soaking up military assets to engage with, understand, potentially help control those respective populations in a time of conflict, extrapolated over the extent of Southeast Asia, is a huge problem. Of course, the elements of the size of the PLA and what level of forces they may be able to bring to bear in form of conflict only further soaks up some of the number of people that we're talking about across our respective militaries. And this might not happen in isolation. A present fear across the strategic studies community here in Canberra is we may very quickly find ourselves, if the Ukraine conflict continues to escalate, that NATO is decisively engaged. It may be the perfect time for Xi to decide that it's a fortuitous moment to engage in a forcible occupation of Taiwan. That may then mean that the size of the coalition that could either be brought to bear in crisis to deter the CCP from that course of action, or alternatively find itself in conflict, maybe a lesser coalition than what would otherwise be desired. And of course, the United States may find itself torn between those tensions. Do we turn to the Pacific or do we turn to Europe? Do we turn to some of our own problems in the greater Americas, such as the challenges that are being faced on the southern border and with narco trafficking? Those concurrencies all come together to present a real challenge in terms of where military assets will be drawn and employed across the Indo-Pacific region.
I'm fascinated by your reference, unsurprisingly, to the PLA. And with your study in this topic, can you give us some insight into how the PLA looks at counterinsurgency or foreign internal defense?
My answer, Mark, in that regard would be that that it is still the Chinese Communist Party. And so there are continuities that we can draw from conflicts as early as the Chinese Civil War and Mao's fight with the nationalists. Those continuities basically extend to highly effective means of exerting population control. I say that in the context, of course, of the Chinese support to the Vietnamese throughout the Vietnamese wars, the French, the American, and then subsequently the conflict that Vietnam had with China. In all of those wars, there are facets of population control where Chinese advice to the Vietnamese or Chinese contestation with the Vietnamese led to a refinement of the ability to control a population. And this is pre-internet era. They've only refined those capabilities over time. Social credit scores, surveillance capabilities. In a JSOW report, I termed these things weapons of mass surveillance. And they are. They exert a certain effect and size and scale beyond simply the numbers themselves. They have a certain quality of their own. Of course, Beijing has been challenged by the ETIM insurgency, the East Turkestan Islamic movement, otherwise known as the Uyghur insurgency in Western China, which has given us insight into their abilities to exert population control. And frankly, it's very, very effective. Some of those methods have then begun exporting not only into Southeast Asia, but across to Africa and other regions as well. That gives grounds for concern as to the ability of a force to be able to blend into local populations in the digital age. Some of those technologies in particular are being fielded in Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, within our region. And so there are challenges there that would undoubtedly occur if we found ourselves engaged in some form of conflict in those respective areas.
I'd like to try and pick your brain a little bit about some medical aspects of irregular warfare. Still, a student of history probably has some insight into past campaigns in IndoPACOM that produced unique injury patterns or illness patterns. Give me your spin on that. What sort of things are we looking at in terms of casualties and casualty management in IndoPACOM that we did not experience in 25 years of fighting in Southwest Asia and CENTCOM?
Interesting you should ask, Mark. Quite literally today, I had a colleague who is in Papua New Guinea at the moment, and he shot me a note to flag that he's just contracted malaria, and in addition has another form of bug, some form of gastro that's going on. So I feel for the guy, and not a good place to be in. So of course, those sort of challenges, of course, exist throughout the tropical regions of Southeast Asia today. But to your earlier question about the aspect of earlier conflicts, what first came to mind is an interesting story under the name of Operation Tulip, which was a British-led mission pre-Pearl Harbor, sending advisors into the nationalist Chinese areas of Chongqing and offering a train, advise, assist mission, or perhaps a support to resistance mission, depending on your doctrine, to Chinese guerrillas that were fighting the Japanese. The intent of that mission was to try to soak up some of that Japanese bandwidth to prevent their ability to then project offensively against Singapore, the Philippines, and as we know, it was unsuccessful by virtue of the way World War II played out. But part of the reason it was unsuccessful was that military mission was debilitated by tropical diseases, non-battle casualty type of illnesses and injuries. And by debilitated, I do literally mean, looking through the history of this unit, some 300 advisors where, generally speaking, 50% of people were able to be employed at any given time. And that situation, including malnutrition and fatigue, only getting worse over time. The mission only lasted about 2 years before it was being withdrawn back to India, simply due to the health of the people involved. Now, while that example is 75 odd years ago, there are parts of the region that haven't changed that much. And so I do suspect that there would be those sort of challenges that we would have to grapple with. In a similar example, when I read through Australian history in South Vietnam over the 60s and the 70s, the aspects of needing to take troops out of the fight for periods of time, to rehabilitate, to put weight back on, of course, prior to going into combat zones, acclimatization timeframes that they would need to undertake. They're all factors that frankly have not gone away and would need to continue to be part of our calculus as we're considering, in particular in crisis, how do we get people into some of these tropical areas, worst case in the middle of a wet season, and then have them immediately starting to operate effectively. That'll be a challenge.
Well, and it occurs to me that that drain on human resources, the non-battle casualties that succumb to tropical illnesses, we're thinking historically in terms of the Foreign Internal Defense Counterinsurgency Security Force Assistance approach, where we still have the ability to evacuate out or bring medical resources to them. If we're looking at this from an unconventional warfare viewpoint, where our ability to get resources in and get casualties out is so greatly degraded by our adversaries' capabilities, wow, having 30% of your force dealing with malaria is a much more difficult problem than if you can put them on get them into a medical treatment facility or put them on an aircraft and evacuate them out of the operational area.
Well, and further to that, Mark, is also then the challenges of distance. If we're to consider aspects of just simple transportation around the region, the airlines that service many of the Indonesian archipelago states, well, they don't hit all of the islands. There's several thousand islands in that overall chain. And so actually boats, barges, seaborne transportation is actually the best form of local transport to some of these isolated regions. There is no non-standard aviation option to some of these areas either. And so now we're adding additional time to our calculus as we go through not only force projection, but also evacuation.
Yeah, fascinating. The maritime domain is so challenging, and we've not, certainly after 25 years in Southwest Asia, we've let our abilities atrophy, I would say, is probably an understatement. But moving people island to island, especially in a contested space where the adversary has considerable capability in terms of anti-access, air defense, etc. What are your thoughts on, let's push this UW scenario with its attendant casualties out of the jungle and into the mega cities, the Jakartas, the Manilas, the Taipeis. What are your thoughts on how we are going to be able to manage our casualties logistically when those casualties are occurring in and around these massive urban areas, again, with significant adversary capabilities to keep us from moving resources in or evacuating casualties out?
Yeah. The aspect of megacities is one hell of a problem for a couple of different factors. What I was just describing there about some of the elements of sheer distance and disparity, again, we've got a huge level of disparity here with regards to some of our city-states. Places like Singapore that have such a high level of medical support, transportation options, standard of living, etc., are of course first world city centres. And there are parts of Bangkok, Manila, Indonesia, Jakarta, Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh, what used to be Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. These sort of hubs are, and in their city-state areas, first world in terms of some of the standards of living that you'll see there. But then you project out a couple of kilometres and you start to find yourself in areas that are a lot less than that. Project yourself out a little bit further and now you're in shanty towns. Project yourself a bit further out again onto the rural-urban fringe, and you very well may find yourself with a rural environment that hasn't actually changed much at all in the last 50-odd years. My point being is that there will be this micro-level spectrum of variance that to me is quite different from what I've seen in places like Europe, to a degree, some places in the Middle East. And that variance, I think, will make it challenging because you can range very, very quickly from being able to leverage local facilities, being able to leverage local healthcare systems, having a good level of supply that you can tap into, to, in a short area not too far distant, now effectively finding yourself in a completely austere environment. I think that variance is a challenge for planners because you have no real choice. You kind of have to plan off worst case. But I bring that spectrum up from a point of view of course, there'll be plenty of opportunities for being able to leverage local infrastructure. The tiger economies of Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand over the past 40-odd years have truly lifted an enormous amount of people out of poverty. And it would be remiss to not make due consideration of that fact and the opportunity that that provides us as planners in considering different Western conflicts. My colleague Dave Kilcullen really struggled with is this element of out of the mountains and now the time of the urban guerrilla. It could mean a little bit more of an operating concept that looks a lot more like terrorism, frankly. The Tupamaros in Uruguay being the old school Cold War era example that we pointed to of what a urban insurgency looks like. And that can be challenging for us if we're trying to discredit in a UW campaign, a campaign that's seeking to undermine and erode the governing authority of a particular territory. We may really, really struggle with a bit of soul searching as we look to, well, is this actually terrorism or is it a legitimate and moral use of force? That dilemma, I think, is easier when we're considering resistance and support to resistance because another country has had to invade to begin with. There's a clear that country is the aggressor, and in so doing, we're righteous in being able to eject that oppressor from that country and liberate its people.
What are your thoughts about lessons learned? I'll put this in quotations, but lessons learned from Ukraine in modern war, end quote, in the third decade of the 20th, with the active targeting of medical resources by the Russians as a part of their campaign to demoralize the population and break their will to resist. How do you see that approach being applied by our adversary in IndoPACOM in terms of using ubiquitous technical surveillance, unmanned aerial systems, and the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, including medical infrastructure, to fight an insurgency that we are supporting?
Mark, I'll answer your question by first dealing with a little thought bubble so I don't lose it. And that is that I think conflict in the Indo-Pacific region may actually be more non-violent in character. And what I mean by that is it might look a lot more like what we've seen in Hong Kong over the last decade. Starting with that thought bubble, some of those elements of targeting medical treatment facilities were a characteristic of the way in which policing repression was exerted in Hong Kong against some of those protesters. There's a couple of excellent books that really unpack those elements of how the Hong Kongese resistance engaged in their protest movements. One that comes to mind is Defying the Dragon. So I bring that up to begin with because it's not so much about solely lessons from Ukraine, There have already been some of these examples in our region. Another example in that regard is the way that the junta in Myanmar has been engaging in its own protest movements starting in 2021 that then descended into the civil war that exists there today. Same types of dynamics where non-violent protests were being waged. We were seeing dynamics of excessive force being used in some cases to repress those protests, and also a level of targeting against medical facilities with all of the attendant challenges that then creates. What first came to mind was the aspect of how we can continue to have our humanity in the way that we consider these conflicts. And what I mean by that is the way in which the Ukrainian state continued to show its legitimacy by reaching out to populations in occupied areas of Kherson and elsewhere, and providing them through the resistance networks in those local areas with their diabetes medicine, with other forms of medicines. And I think it's actually very, very clever. By pre-preparing in a resistance sense of continuing to say your state cares about you, even if you are being oppressed in an occupied region, is a way in which an adversary's narrative of you are now part of the Russian state or the erosion of one country, two systems language, where we see that element of legitimacy being carried over, I think is quite a powerful thing in today's digital age.
Well, this is very clearly a broad and very complex topic, especially when you start to factor in the complexities of logistics in a contested environment, which is a whole nother series of topics that we're planning on addressing with some folks who study that diligently on this MSIW podcast. We can spend a lot of time trying to run this stuff to ground. Unfortunately, we do need to wrap it up. Andy, if you can distill today's discussion into the one or two most important takeaways you'd like a medical or a medical planning audience to absorb about the nature of irregular warfare in IndoPACOM, what would those one or two key takeaways be?
Well, first and foremost, I think is the aspect of we do need to prepare for the risk of conflict while we hope that it won't come about. The language of enhancing resilience, preparing for resistance, I think is quite valuable in this regard because of the aspect of so many of these countries sitting aside the ring of fire or of volcanic humanitarian disaster threats, the impacts of tropical cyclones, hurricanes, but in the southern hemisphere for broader audiences, and the impact of typhoons. There is an element of many of the countries in the region do need support and help with enhancing their resilience. And this is a good thing. We should be seeking to enhance and lift people out of poverty, and we should be pursuing an element of gaining familiarity with a potential operating environment by doing such missions. Viewed in that light, humanitarian assistance, to my mind, isn't necessarily a distraction from preparations for conflict. In fact, it may also be a very beneficial vector for being able to demonstrate the value proposition that Western governments show, the utility in offering a different model to that which the Chinese offer for how they go about a government in a particular area. By gaining familiarity, we'll better understand things like where are these medical facilities? Where are areas that are just completely off the grid that will need a significantly greater amount of support? It allows us to dive into that micro detail, those micro spectrums that I was talking about, and gain a better level of clarity to understand what our risk profiles will be in different areas. So my first point to your question is resilience. Resilience is what matters for the here and now, and it has a long tail on it that can provide support for a fair while into our future. Going a little bit sharper than that as a second point is the element of mass being impossible at the point of conflict. There's a couple of reasons for that. First, the challenges in force projection. From an Australian point of view, we lack some of those force projection assets that would allow for a single lift of a divisional size force. That would be incredibly difficult for us to consider. If there's other concurrencies, of course, that makes that type of massing very, very difficult. So the mass of being able to put a field hospital into being able to support large numbers of troops will have to contend with those force projection challenges. And even then, and even if we can lift it forward, we're dealing with a pacing threat that has long-range strike capabilities that would make the electronic signature, not to mention other forms of signature, that would make the massing of such a force incredibly likely to be targeted. And so we now have a strong imperative to keep a level of dispersion. I was very clear just a second ago in terms of pacing threat, because if there's another concurrency going on here in the operating environment, it's looking outside of our region. If the Ukrainians and the Houthis can effect a form of sea denial using uncrewed systems, then we should be entirely expecting that other non-state actors, criminal groups, capable insurgencies, may also be able to effect a Houthi-like disruption on maritime choke points, either right now or in a few short years from now. Another interesting aspect that I was reading about only today was the increase in piracy that's occurring in the Malacca Straits, just outside of Singapore. The point being, the non-state actor hasn't gone away. The non-state actor is gaining a level of asymmetry through uncrewed systems that do impact at the operational and strategic level, with this overall point of mass isn't an option. We need to fight dispersed. We need to move around the theatre in a dispersed way, with all of the inherent challenges that then creates. If I had to offer one last thought, and this links back to the unconventional warfare concerns and opportunities. Every country in Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific has experienced some form of insurgency or political violence since World War II. Every single one. Some countries, multiple times over, with different forms of insurgency that have ebbed, flowed, evolved over time. My point is that if we're considering unconventional warfare options, there is very likely to be latent grievances, frustrations that may provide opportunities to engage in that type of conflict. But the reverse is also true. They may provide opportunities for proxy conflict that threaten Western interests, the rule of law, or other dynamics to which we consider important. And I do think that is our most likely threat, and a good way of summing up my answer to you, Mark, with a key takeaway. And honestly, my opinion is that proxy conflict is what we're most likely to be seeing in the Indo-PACOM region. That'll look like insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, all of those things that we supposedly have walked away from. It's 2021.
Well, and to me, it points out that divestment in soft power, disengagement in the theater for that kind of area orientation, language capability, understanding the human terrain is just short-sighted. If we're going to understand the complexities of this potential future battlefield, we have to be in the game. We have to be forward. We have to be doing this humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, security force assistance type of work just to understand the players and the intricacies of the politics in such a complex theater. Wow. Hey, on that note, I'd like to thank Dr. Andy Maher for joining us today and sharing his insights and expertise. This episode is the first of several episodes that we hope to focus on MSIW in the Pacific. We'll be following up with some specific medical providers as well and getting their viewpoints and counter viewpoints to Dr. Maher's view as a strategist and looking historically at irregular warfare throughout the region. You can find more information about Dr. Maher as well as his writings in the description below, and we're also going to be posting up pertinent references and links. If you're watching this on YouTube, please smash that like button. Consider subscribing to the PFC podcast and forward this episode of the podcast on to anybody that you think would benefit from seeing it. If these subjects are important to you, we'd like you to consider joining the Special Operations Medical Association and engaging with us in bringing your expertise and your knowledge to the community and sharing all of that with everyone else so that we can all get better. Finally, I'd like to thank Dennis and the leadership of the PFC podcast and the Prolonged Field Care Collective once again for their mentorship and getting us going. Please take good care of yourself, your teammates, and your casualties. G'day.
That's it for today's podcast. Make sure to go to our website, www.prolongedfieldcare.org. Check out our free downloads and a ton of other helpful information. Grab a bag of our fresh roasted PFC coffee, links in the description below, and stay on the bleeding edge of combat and austere medicine. This is Dennis for the PFC podcast, out.